Welcome to Killer Psychologist. I'm Dana Anderson, a forensic psychologist and your host of the show. Killer Psychologist is for true crime fanatics and anyone intrigued with the dark side of psychology. Welcome to the Killer Psychologist. We have the A-team here with us today. So, of course, we have Jason Jensen, cold case investigator, who's been on the show with us before. But Jason came up with this idea for today's show, talking about sadism and the origin of that term and getting into Jack the Ripper and some other notorious serial killers. We also have a forensic psychiatrist today. And I know before I've mentioned that either forensic psychiatrists are either retired or dead, but I found one. Dmitry Bick, he's here with us today, and I'm really excited because I've been trying to partner with a forensic psychiatrist because they are so rare. But I'm so excited about his input today because he did his dissertation on serial sexual killers. And so I met up with him and said, yes, please come on the show. We all are in touch with our sadistic side. We have a lot to talk about. And I'm a forensic psychologist. And of course, Dr. Craig Wetter is a forensic psychologist and an attorney. And so we have some interesting stories. But I definitely want to get started with Jason because he wants to go into the origin of sadism and that term and where it came from. So, Jason.
Hi, Dana. Hi, all. It was quite interesting how we came along this topic. Last episode that you released, number 7, Craig had brought up sadism in the context of JonBenet Ramsey's Killer. So that triggered a light bulb for me. I'm like, hey, I haven't really seen any podcasts talking about sadism. And with this all-star panel where you're actually looking at it from a professional perspective rather than like a documentarian or a follower, a fan, if you will. But I thought that if we all had this discussion, this could actually be not just informative and educational, but entertaining as well. So one of the assignments that I did while I was in college for my criminology, my master's degree, I had an abnormal psychology course that I had to take. It was about Jack the Ripper, a sadist. And it really opened the door to the origin of the word because I'm a sicko. I study etymology, among other things. So I looked up the etymology, and lo and behold, it actually was a coined phrase sadist in association with Jack the Ripper in a London newspaper publication in 1888. So it's like, wow, this is the origin of the word in relationship to Jack the Ripper. Not sure how many of you all knew that, but it was an eye-opener for me as a master's student. So as we're studying that, and I'm trying to answer the question, was Jack the Ripper a sadist? You have to fall back on where did the word come from? And it actually comes from the word a name, Marquis de Sade, which is a French nobleman who wrote some very salacious papers, books, if you will, in the 1700s, so 1785 to 1791, about violence and the sexual gratification associated with violent acts. So, that really kind of brings us up to where we are and whatever input you guys have.
Can I give a hot take on Jack the Ripper? Because I may have a different take on him than anybody else, because the myth behind him is that he's this kind of grand master serial killer that everybody sort of looks at as I don't want to be this guy, but like the GOAT serial killer kind of guy. But to be honest with you, there's nothing really special about him. And the reason that everybody sort of looks at him as that guy is because he was never caught. Had he done that stuff in the way he did it today, or even reasonably within our time period, he would have been caught very quickly. because he had no special, he really didn't do anything to kind of keep himself from getting caught, right? The period that he did it in was a period where there wasn't very many forensic tools to kind of catch guys like this. He was brutal, he was mean, and he did all of the things that sadistic sexual serial killers do. And he was never caught. But he didn't really try to hide himself. He kind of did it out in the open. He kind of just left the evidence out there. But people make movies about him and they write books and they have all these theories, and it's mostly because he wasn't caught, but there really isn't anything special about him with regards to method. In other words, we can't really learn very much from him as far as psychology. And I think people are trying to do that. And I don't know what you can learn from this guy.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Give me an idea.
Because I was listening to the Yorkshire Ripper documentary last night, and I was listening to the actual footage of the investigators at the time saying, this is the most sophisticated man right out there. And okay, this is 100 years after Jack the Ripper. Cut to chase. Look at the cliff notes right now of the Yorkshire Ripper. He had a severe mental disorder. Okay. And he was not sophisticated at all. He did go undetected for a long time, but think about that period of time and why.
Right.
I mean, he was flailing the bodies wide open in the street. And he killed 13 women, which Jack the Ripper killed, was it 5?
One of the things that makes Jack the Ripper unique also is that he and again, this I might be wrong, but he was probably one of the first. And again, this is retrospective. I don't know that was a psychopath, but I think our conceptions of psychopathy may have started kind of with someone like him, because we're talking, the period in which he committed these crimes. Modern psychiatry, modern psychology wasn't even in existence yet. I mean, we had, correct me if I'm wrong, but neurology was generally kind of the dominant area of medicine that looked at any psychiatric problems. Psychiatry was still very, very young back then. Even psychology, like our, modern psychoanalytic theory, didn't originate until the late 1890s, early 1900s. Around that time.
He's the first serial killer in what we consider the modern definition of serial killers. So what the FBI would consider a serial killer, which is a killer that kills for some type of emotional need, then has a cooling off period, and then does it again with another cooling off period and does it again. Whereas we think of the older serial killers, so like when I was doing my presentation in my residency, when I looked back at the history, we don't have detailed evidence of why Roman emperors killed people, like Caligula, for instance. Why did he go and he killed all these people? We don't know that he did it with a cooling off period. Elizabeth Bathory, for instance, she would kill young women and she would bathe in their blood. She did that because she thought that made her younger. And that's serial killer, right? She killed young women serially. But did she do it with a cooling off period? Did she do it for some type of emotional gratification? Well, we're never going to really know that, but she is by definition a serial killer. There are others. I mean, I could go in. Fred Baker was a serial killer in England, but he is, you're right, considered the first of that type. So I think that's why he gets that status. But as far as what can we learn from him to help us catch these other guys, I think it's interesting to speculate on who he is. That's what's interesting about him, is who is this guy? And in an age where I think there was a cop on the corner, and I don't know this for a fact, but there's a cop on almost every corner in England at that time, right? And they communicated with whistles. You would hear screaming. They couldn't find some guy running with a coat and a hat.
Okay.
Bloody hands everywhere. We could.
I think maybe that's why the police, in response, had to say they believed him to be so sophisticated because they couldn't capture him. But yeah, it was really interesting listening to some of the footage from the Yorkshire Ripper, the dialogue between law enforcement And there was a lot of changes in law enforcement at that time, and there was a lot of disorganization. And they were interviewing some of the people at that time who were just taking calls and just logging papers, just logging. I mean, they had this paper system. All the tips that came in, they couldn't even get to putting all the tips together. It was so disorganized. I couldn't imagine trying to solve a case like that now, like with no database.
The Yorkshire Ripper was the 70s, so they didn't have modern computer technology. And that guy was essentially the same type of criminal as Jack the Ripper, but he had better technology. So he had a car, for instance, so he could get more people. He could take them to different places. So he essentially was the same type of criminal with better technology, and he got away with it for longer. But he did what most modern serial killers do, which is he made a mistake. And he was seen. And when you get seen, and someone catches, in that case, I think he got his license plate seen. That's how serial killers get caught nowadays, is somebody catches you and they figure out your car, your plate, and that's how you get caught. The best way a serial killer doesn't get caught now is to stay off the grid or go into places that you're not known. So, like, for instance, Israel Keys. This guy would never have been caught had he not done one thing. And I don't know why he did it. And had I been in a room, I would have asked him this. And not as a forensic psychiatrist doing an evaluation, but as a psychiatrist trying to get information for future people so that we can catch these people. But I would have asked him why he asked for ransom. The first person he killed that he admitted to was an 18-year-old girl in Alaska. He pulled her out of her coffee shop job at this little coffee house that was open in the middle of the night. He took her home, he killed her, and then he saw the news on her disappearance, and he went and he asked for ransom from her parents because he had her debit card. So he asked for money to get to use her debit card. And this guy would fly to different places, rent cars, and then drive all over the country. And he was using her debit card. And so they were tracking debit card withdrawals across the country. And he would go in and, he had his mask up so the camera wouldn't catch him. But they found his license plate in one of the videos. And they tracked his license. They tracked the car, and a cop in Texas, a ranger, saw the plate, pulled him over, and that's how they got him. So, but he was killing people. He abducted her, and then he had been killing people for years before this. He would fly to a location, rent a car, drive to another state, kill someone at random, fly home, give the car back, fly home. This was his MO. How do you stay anonymous in a digital world where there's tracking and GPS everywhere? You go to a place nobody expects you to be, you kill someone, you go to another state. Because everyone, when someone dies, they look in your area. Who do you know? Where have you been? What bar did you go to? Who did you meet? No one expects someone from another state to come in and kill you and then disappear. And he would have these caches of weapons, guns, and rope that he would bury in the woods. He would go to the state. You knew where they were. He would go. He would dig these things up. He would have a kill kit, rent the car, put the kill kit in, go randomly pick someone. Because, again, when police investigate, and you're an investigator, Jason, you know this, police look for people that you know. That's the first people they think of. They don't think random crime when you think this kind of murder. Randomly pick people out of the blue, kill them, bury them, go back, bury his kit, and then disappear to another state. And he was getting away with it for years, but he did this ransom thing, and that's trackable. Why would you do that? And he never gave that information up in his interrogations. This guy would have been this guy would have been our modern Jack the Ripper. There's something about the narcissism of these guys, and to me, that's the most interesting part, is, along with the sadism, is that need for exposure.
At some point, I think some of these people, it doesn't become enough for them to continue in the pattern of behavior. At some point, they want recognition for that, and that's that narcissistic piece that you're speaking to, which we see this obviously in the dark triad traits, right? Which is the narcissistic, and then the psychopathic, and then this sort of Machiavellianism component as well. By going undetected, you're not getting that recognition. I mean, as sick as that is, that could be an internal driver for some of these folks. And I think that's come out in a couple cases in the past where they've actually said that. They're like, yeah, I wanted to get caught at some point. It's like, and it's almost like I don't want to call it a death, depending on the state you're in, it could be a death wish, right? But at some point, yeah, I think they have such a need for admiration. They want that validation, as sick as it is. They're not good.
They want to get credit for their work. Remember BTK was the Zodiac killer. The Yorkshire Ripper, always taunting the cops. But there seemed to be this, it would go back and forth with the police writing memos in the newspaper, or this back and forth. But BTK, he went out of his way. He wanted recognition. He was getting frustrated that the cops weren't identifying him.
BTK is another one. He would never have gotten caught. He was killing in the 70s. And he went a period, I think, for 18 or 20 years where he, I think, didn't do anything. And no one was talking about him. And he couldn't handle it. And that's why he sent the floppy disk. And the stupidest thing he did in that is, I'll send you something else, but you can't trace it. Like you're not allowed to trace it. And they're like, yeah, sure. Send it to us. We won't use our forensics at all to trace it. And it's like, really? Like, you're that? Yeah. It's like, okay, I'll send it to you, but you can't trace me if I'll send it to you. Like, but it's that need for, and I don't think he wanted to get caught. I just think he wanted the recognition of, that look at me, Louie. If you take that step back out of yourself, that they may not have that ability to do that. You could go on and do this forever.
Jason, did you say there's, at any given time in the United States, there's probably about 100 serial killers that are operating out there that, I don't know that this is empirically, if there's empirical support, but I think that was an estimate that I've seen in the literature.
That's not a quote from me, but, you're right. There's dozens, if not hundreds of active serial killers out there, because we have over 200 and some odd, like 240,000 unsolved homicides out there. Any number of them can be connected if they knew who they were. So they're unsolved. So you can't bridge those crimes together to show a murder and then a cooling off period followed by another murder. So, when they catch them, like Israel Keys, then they can put it all together. Who was responsible for what? Modern times, like right now, we it would be something like the recent Morin case up in Maryland, where they don't know who killed her, but they have his DNA. And when they ran the DNA through CODIS, they found that months earlier he had committed a crime in L.A. So where there was a DNA profile. So that's, if not fitting the definition of a serial killer, if there was a third or more, when definitely he would.
Well, what's interesting about the DNA, with CODIS, which is a federal database, I think the FBI maintains that, and part of that NCIC network, is now with familial, genealogy. Now, this is where a lot of these folks are now being caught, because now they're looking at creating these genealogy maps, right? And it's a lot of work if you see what investigators have to go through. But that's the Golden State Killer started all of this. And that was right here. It's where I'm at right now today in Sacramento. That was the Sacramento County DA, Anne-Marie Schubert, was pinnacle in this groundbreaking approach to catching these folks that have gone undetected for decades. In the case of the Golden State Killer, he was undetected for at least 3 decades at least, because he stopped killing, presumably in the 1980s. Who knows? He might have killed other people that we don't know about necessarily. But that's how they got him, and that's how a lot of these cases are getting solved now, right?
The Moscow, Idaho guy, what's his name? Brian Kohlberg. He was caught that way too. He's not a serial killer by definition yet because they got him, but his behavior in that one murder, because I think he killed 4 people in that one murder, but his modus and his behavior indicated that it's possible that he could have been potentially. He might have been in a cooling off period at that point. So he could have been
because they got his father's DNA. They went to the house
and they caught him on a genealogy,
Pennsylvania or somewhere, and they got dad's DNA, and then from that, obviously, they were able to link him.
It was a 23andMe. They got him on a 23andMe. So all you budding serial killers.
You know, it's over for me too, because my family is doing all of that right now. They're going back 100 years and they're getting really into it.
Yep, mine too.
I want to ask you guys a question.
Yeah.
A little serial killer trivia time. What would you consider the perfect job for a serial killer? What do you think they do for their career during the day? What would be ideal? According to the FBI.
Oh, I'd say a truck driver.
Yeah, that's
yeah. Jason, you're my man. Of course you know that. Of course you know that. So I have to say,
of course the PI
my son and daughter-in-law, they live in Kentucky, and their family has a big ranch that backs up to the highway. And they had a body being thrown off the truck down on their farmland. Probably a serial killer. They had to call the cops. And my daughter-in-law was saying, it's pretty surprising the stuff they just throw off from the freeway. And so bodies. So according to the FBI in 2016, if there is such a thing as an ideal profession for a serial killer, it may well be as a long-haul truck driver.
See?
They said there's around 750 corpses lying along Americans' roads. Well, of course, it's ideal, right? You're driving all around.
You drive into a city that you don't live in. You randomly select someone. You kill them there. You dump them somewhere, usually in the woods, because that's where the truck stops are, right? And then you disappear into another state that you usually don't live in. That's exactly what Israel Keyes was doing. He was literally a truck driver, but he wasn't driving trucks. It's a perfect
you
profession.
Also, in a sense, have an alibi in the event you perhaps get identified as a person of interest, right? Because it's like, well, I'm driving through, so that's why I was there. And,
that's right.
And so
I was driving through.
And then along the lines of what we had just been talking about, Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, and BTK, which is Dennis Rader, law enforcement.
Yeah, well, so we know we want to talk about who's more likely to be a psychopath, right? Where is there overrepresentation of psychopathy, in the workforce? And we do know that, at least but also surgeons and lawyers
and military.
Yep,
and CEOs. So CEOs are overrepresented, and depending on the study, you're looking at double digits. It can be up to 12%, perhaps, of CEOs meet criteria on at least on Hare's PCL, which is psychopathy checklist criteria. And you're right. And so in law enforcement as well. So I've talked to Dana about this before. We both, I don't know, Dana, are you doing pre-employment psych screens for police, for cops anymore? Probably not. I still do them, and that's one of the things we look for. I look for it, and we should look for it. And we do see elevations sometimes, and there is this happy level, I call it, where I want a little bit of psychopathic deviance, which is on the MMPI. That's our scale. It was originally a scale 4. It's now RC4. And I want a little bit, but I don't want too much. And the reason I don't want too much, obviously, is because when that's too high, then we start to worry about, okay, this person is probably going to have difficulty controlling their impulses. They're going to have lots of externalizing behavioral dysfunction and discontrol, and that's a no-no. But I need a little bit of it, because you have to be a risk taker to be a police officer, right? Because if you're not a risk taker, you're not going to necessarily be successful. So I've trained a lot of police officers when I was an officer, and I was a field training officer for a lot of years. And, timid officers are officers that can get themselves hurt or killed or get their partners killed. So we look for a little bit of it, but there's a balance, there's a fine line. And sometimes it's hard to know where that fine line is in terms of how much is too much.
Craig, do you have your CDL?
I passed my Psych, so I don't know. I don't know what my original MMPI looked like when I first started, and that was a long time ago. But I'm suspecting I was maybe a little elevated on that scale. But
I have it right here. The top 3 professions for psychopaths are, get ready, because Craig is 2 out of 3.
I'm at the edge of my seat.
Okay. CEO, which I'm a CEO, but
So am I.
this doesn't mean anything. I just demoted myself. The second one is a lawyer. Craig, you're out. Craig,
I'm done.
You're the dark triad. CEO, lawyer, cop.
I was a paralegal for 14 years.
The third one is, which I didn't factor this in. So CEO, this is psychopaths we're talking about. Top 3 professions. I don't know. Did we pick the profession or did the profession pick us? CEO, lawyer, and media personality.
Well, that's interesting.
Is that a new list? Because I feel like that's like within the last
this is fairly
15
new.
years or so. Because like 30 years ago, I'm not sure that would be true. I don't see like Tom Brokaw as like a psychopath.
Although with all the sexual misconduct that's come up the last 10, 15 years, with NBC, the Today Show, and things like that, there has been, accusations of anchors and celebrities.
So let's look at the career of some of the top serial killers. Ted Bundy once worked the phones at CIA.
He was trying to be a lawyer. He never made
a lawyer.
it.
Well, he wanted to be his own lawyer.
Yeah, he was in law school.
He
didn't complete law school, but
he was a media personality. So he worked the suicide hotline at the crisis center.
Yeah, for the police.
And can I just say that John Wayne Gacy, he worked at KFC. I'm just throwing that one out there. I've never looked at KFC the same. Fried chicken.
I was the employee of the year at KFC in 1985.
I prefer Popeyes. Just
this
saying.
is bad
There's nothing about
publicity for KFC.
Popeyes
I'm
is
just
better.
saying.
Wasn't he an insurance guy?
You have a giant.
I thought John Wayne Gacy was like this, sort of model citizen too. Like he was like a pillar in his,
He was a clown.
he was a clown on this. Yeah, but I think he worked like he worked in some type of a white collar, position, and he was like, again, these people that we don't think, how could he do something like that?
All of these guys are model citizens. All of these guys. BTK had a family and kids. Israel Keys had a wife and kids. Bundy was like the guy next door. John Wayne Gacy was a kid's clown. All these guys are like, oh, I never thought he was a serial killer. Now you ask people and they're like, they don't want to talk to the guy next door because the guy next door is a serial killer.
Yeah, there's one guy that doesn't fit that sort of that profile, and that would be Jeffrey Dahmer. Yeah.
Dahmer's the one that everyone points to because he was the weirdo in the building, because his apartment always smelled, and it's very weird that like the people in their building would always call the police on him and say that his apartment smelled. You need to get this guy out of here, and the kids would come out of his apartment all like kind of drunk looking, and the police would come up and be like, this is very
1980s, like, yeah.
Like nowadays, this would never happen. Like you can't have drunk kind of African-American woman coming out of a white guy's apartment and being like a child, essentially, and being like, oh no, that's just my friend or my girlfriend or something. They're just drunk. Like a child, a drunk, really coming out of this white guy's apartment, and the police are just like, yeah, everything's fine. Like it'll be fine. But back then, that was okay.
Yeah, they could have caught him they could have caught him earlier on if they had like followed up on some of those sort of obvious warning signs.
If he had a maid
they had
service
knocked on the door,
they would have So Jeffrey Dahmer was in the United States military.
Well, yeah, military. When you talk about people that sort of gravitate, Israel Keys was in the military for 3 years.
I was military.
And you're a CEO. So one thing about serial killers who were in the military, their military career was short-lived. And most of them didn't go to combat. And they were discharged early. Dennis Radar, Air Force mechanics for 4 years. Jeffrey Dahmer, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. He was in the U.S. Navy. The Candyman, Dean Corll. He killed 28 boys. He was a radio repairman in the U.S. Army. Boy, I'm not doing a really good job for the military right now. Just saying. David Berkowitz, U.S. Army.
I believe Zodiac was former U.S. Navy as well.
Well, and there's a selection bias too, because again, you have what's a hallmark of psychopathy? Well, I mean, not to get into the neurobiology of this, but we know that psychopaths are cortically under-aroused, and so that's what leads to thrill-seeking behaviors. So if you happen to be a psychopath, well, what are you going to be attracted to? You're going to be attracted to something that is highly stimulative, something that is, that can engage you, and if that is legally killing people, right? Because you're sanctioned. If you're at a combat deployment, you're legally sanctioned to do that. So, what a perfect fit, if that person is a psychopath. But obviously, it's that the vast majority of the military are not, psychopaths are not represented in the military. There might be a little bit higher than the base rate in the population just because of that selection bias. But just like with law enforcement, we've got psychopaths, working in law enforcement today. I mean.
That reminds me, I did a recent Psych Eval for someone who wanted to join the military, a young man, and he was antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. And I went over the results with him, and I didn't approve him for reasons that were very clear. But one of the problems is with getting into the military, most people don't have a psych eval. He was only referred, they're only referred for certain reasons if they disclose, I don't know all the standards and procedures, but if they admit, say they had a psychiatric hospitalization or something, and they go, oh, go get cleared. But then if you do a thorough psychological evaluation, because they'll always say, oh, it's just a one-time misunderstanding, but there's a lot to uncover there about that. And it's important to not just look on the past, however many years ago that happened, but do the testing for them now and see that this is still a problem. And it's actually a bigger problem, an unresolved issue, and it's manifested into this disorder. And I can't allow you, I am not approving you for the military based on this. Can give them recommendations, but sadly for a lot of professions, there is no screening process.
I was just going to say that, like medicine doesn't have it, so you want to be a.
That's how you got in.
Be a surgeon. So I've always wondered.
There's no psychological screening for medicine. It's purely academic. So you get a smart psychopath, and they're gonna get right into surgery.
I've made this argument, and of course, I work, so I teach in a doctoral program, and I've often presented this to the administration where I'm teaching. I'm wondering why we haven't thought about it for the profession of clinical psychology. So for clinical psychologists, why is there no screening? Why are we not testing to ensure that someone is, one, they're not a psychopath, but also they don't have such significant psychopathology that they're going to be a risk to their patients, right? And so the counter argument is, well, we can vet that out throughout their training program, and we can identify these problems, when they arise. But if someone is a sophisticated psychopath, they're not going to necessarily. That's not going to be evidenced, right? They're going to be very mindful of how they present when they're working with colleagues and professors and that kind of thing. So maybe some warning signs pop through, but I've often wondered this because I've seen folks in the profession that clearly are not appropriate They clearly have some serious mental illness, right? And some of it is masked, but
it's also very rare to find a medical serial killer. They're very rare. Plus, it also comes across in bedside manner, that type of psychopathy. And you get a lot of bad bedside manner doctors that are not psychopaths. They're just really bad at like interacting with people. And surgeons tend to be there in general only because in my interactions, and not all surgeons are like this, but the majority of the ones I've interacted with are like this. Their enjoyment from their job is when they're doing the surgery. And when they have to come out and like explain to you why they did the surgery and how it went, that's not the thing that they're interested in. They just want to go and do the next one. And so they're not good at it. And that doesn't make them a psychopath necessarily. It's just, so do we need to screen medical doctors for psychopathy when you get maybe one medical serial killer like every 10 years? How many psychiatrists are there that are psychopaths? I don't know. It's probably a lot more than we think. But I think that's what makes us good, is it takes one to know one.
And that's why we're good at our job. And Dimitri, I want to say a surgeon, I just looked this up, is the 5th most popular job among known psychopaths. While doctor didn't quite make it's in the top 15. I have questions about them myself because, I'm a doctor, but surgeon being very specific. Anyway, it made the top 5. So that is interesting. You'd have to have a certain level of emotional distance.
Well, that's the protective piece of it too, to some degree, right? Like, so there's something to be said too about, everybody characterizes psychopathy as this all negative, or it's sort of an all bad, thing. And I would argue that that's not entirely true. There are elements of psychopathy, I think, that are adaptive and helpful in some contexts or some situations. But that's where you've heard of the term, like the helpful psychopath, or, the television show that characterized this is not probably the best example, but like Dexter, so he's kind of the psychopath that goes at, well, he's in the helping profession in the sense that he's getting rid of sort of these, bad people.
But he was taught that, right? The story of Dexter is
him.
that
Yeah.
His father identified him as a psychopath very early in his childhood and taught him a technique to channel the psychopathy towards people that were bad. But then you get like a guy like Elon Musk, for instance, and I'm going to rag on him a little bit because it's one of my favorite things to do. And maybe my show will do a thing on him in the near future because he just released a tweet. I don't know if you guys saw this. It said, you can put "never been to therapy" on my tombstone or my gravestone or something like that. And I don't think that that's necessarily something you should be proud of. And he is a good example of the opposite end of that CEO kind of thing. He's probably a functional psychopath. I don't know how, and I'm not saying that. I'm saying that as a completely speculative.
Right,
Elon, by the way.
We haven't formally assessed him,
no
so
idea.
it's like, yeah.
We haven't formally assessed him. To get to that level, you have to be able to cut people out without remorse. And I think when I said that I was a CEO, I think maybe that's the reason I failed, is because when I was doing it, I had an attachment to a particular employee and I refused to get rid of them. And I think that was the reason that my company failed. Whereas Elon doesn't seem to have that problem. He came into Twitter and he just kind of eliminated half of the company. Not to say that that's the reason he is the way he is, but he seems to be successful in that respect.
This is an older case, but I remember this from back when I first started investing. And this is, maybe somebody knows who this was, but there was the CEO. They referred to him as Chainsaw Al. And he came in, so Chainsaw Al, that's literally what they referred to him as. And that was a metaphor for like what this guy would do when he would come into a new company, a large corporation. He came into, so Sunbeam was the corporation where he came in there and he just like took a chainsaw and fired all these people.
And he wasn't a serial killer. But he was
They called him
Chainsaw
Chainsaw
Al.
Al. Google it. I don't know if he's alive anymore. Like I forget. Yeah, find out. It's because that's an interesting
I gotta
case
find out
of where
now
it's
who
like,
this guy is.
this is back before I even had a lot of knowledge of psychopathy.
I'm gonna.
Yeah, Dunlap. Thank you, Dunlap. Sunbeam. Of course, Sunbeam
Albert
went bankrupt.
J. Dunlap.
Yeah, they called him Chainsaw Al, and so
Sunbeam
he
CEO.
You're like, okay, where did that name come from? Like, who decided that was a good name?
I'm gonna reference Chainsaw Al next time anyone tries to do some cuts at work.
Just bring in Chainsaw Al. He'll take care of it.
Yeah, it literally comes in with a chainsaw revved up.
You mentioned the neurobiology earlier. I actually found a meta-analysis of that earlier today of some of the networks involved in this. What I was surprised to find was that usually we think of the amygdala as being hypoactive in serial killers, but this meta-analysis actually found the opposite, that it was actually hyperactive. But they found other dysfunction in other networks. And, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm simply a psychiatrist. So a lot of these neural networks are a step above my pay grade. These are neuroscientific terms for researchers. And I don't want to bore the podcast by reading.
It's even so technical. I'm having a hard time wrapping, understanding how these projections work. But you've got moral reasoning circuits they're clearly deficient. And the anterior cingulate cortex is just one area, and the nucleus accumbens and those areas. And it gets, and we know we can map it. I mean, the neuroscientists, not we. Like I'm not doing this, and our medical school doesn't do any of this in our labs. But
correct.
But there are. They have mapped the psychopathic brain, and we do know that there are irregularities, is a good way to put it, in how these networks, these projections work in the psychopathic brain. That those moral reasoning circuits are turned off in a sense, and that's the reason why when we talk about the lack of conscious formation, the lack of any guilt or feelings of remorse, those capacities are not present in that brain. And this partly explains why, some of these people can do these like horrendous sadistic things that they do. Those areas are just not lighting up. They're not working in the way that they should.
Right. Well, one of the questions that I wanted to answer when I did my residency project back, I know it's like 17 years ago, was, are serial killers born or are they made? And one of the things I looked up at was this kind of research. That research was 17 years old. This one that I looked up is a little bit newer, but the question still remains, because a lot of the serial killers have really bad backgrounds. They were sexually abused, they have trauma in their life, but there's a few of them that didn't. For instance, Herman Mudgett, who's better known
Chicago,
as H.H. Holmes.
Yep.
The guy from Chicago, the White City. There's a really good book on him called the Killer in the White City or something like that. I read that. Basically outlines his killing spree. He grew up in a very wealthy household, was very well taken care of. He never had any trauma. Randall Woodfield was pretty much a good upbringing. Adolph Ruff, Richard Grissom, essentially. I mean, he was brought in from another country and adopted, but pretty good upbringing. So there's certain serial killers that didn't have a trauma in their life. Now, a lot of them still had what they consider the serial killer triad, or had conduct problems. So the question then becomes is, they did have conduct problems. They had the abuse of animals and everything. So there's something structurally wrong with their brain. So are serial killers born because there's something structurally wrong with their brain? Or were serial killers made because a lot of these kids that were abused, like, for instance, the Boston Strangler, I'm blanking on his name right now, DeSalvo, I think was his name. He was really abused. He was exposed to a lot of sexual trauma as a child. And that's not an unheard of trauma for a lot of these guys. I think Dahmer had a whole host of abandonment issues with his mom, and his father and his parents were always getting back and forth together. I think that's why he said that he was drilling holes in the heads of his victims, because they could never leave. That's why he was doing that. He had abandonment issues. So a lot of these guys have trauma history. So is it the trauma that's making them do this, or are they just born bad? And at the end of my research when I did this, is the answer was, I don't know. And I think 17 years later, if I redid all of this research, what would I find?
And I looked at the literature pretty extensively in this area, and I would, and this is just my opinion, but I think we're getting closer to understanding the epigenome in terms of how there's biologic genetic predispositions or vulnerabilities that so let's just say the brain of a psychopath has there's genetic predisposition or loadings for this. And yeah, the epigenome is essentially the environmental press, or what happens in the environment that to a child during their developmental phase as they're growing up, that can turn on some of these genes that again, these are critical. There's critical periods where the brain is pruning and neural networks are forming. The brain is not finished when an infant's born. And maybe people don't know that, but the frontal lobes don't really develop until the early 25-ish, right around there. Females actually develop a little faster than men do. I don't know if people know that, but that's why women tend to be a little more mature than men in the late adolescence, and so that's where we see differentials in risk taking. And boys and adolescent or younger men tend to be more risk taking. That when they're younger, we can explain that through the frontal lobe, the lack of that frontal development. But I think that there is that. So there's that intersectionality between the vulnerabilities, the genetic vulnerabilities that someone's born with, and then certainly adverse child experiences that intersect that, because we see that in a lot of them. But you're right, a lot of psychopaths, they actually had fairly normal background in terms of what we know. Normal backgrounds, meaning no fairly secure attachments to parental caregivers, because that's another thing to look at is what did the attachment style look like when they were children or when they were growing, when they were very very young, because we know that a lack of healthy attachment is a huge risk factor for a lot of other problems down the road, including substance use disorder and the development of other serious mental illness. So really looking carefully at like early childhood, I think is key in a majority of these cases. But I don't know. That's the thing, is that we haven't been able to, I think, completely figure that out yet. But the neuroscience is advancing so quickly that we'll probably have an answer at some point in the future.
Craig, there's an excellent book that I have. It's called The Creation of Dangerous and Violent Criminals by Lonnie Athens. And it's very violent recollections of criminals describing their thought process and how they eventually began to normalize these horrific acts. It's pretty in-depth. It's a great book, but they talk about how they tortured their victims, and their excerpts from many different individuals. And it's their dialogue. It's direct interviews with these sadistic people who tortured their victims, and how they rationalized it from at a young age, and how it got to the point where. So The Creation of Dangerous, Violent Criminals, but it'll really make you think. It's a very deep read. So if you just kind of take little sections of it, because it is, there's a lot of sadistic torture in there, but it's, if you want to read that, you should tuck yourself into bed tonight. Yep. I actually have it on my dining room table. Yeah, so some people are into those reads. I like to figure out how people think. I think now's a good time for a break. All right, I'm cracking open a Red Bull.